Okay, let's see. Am I unmuted? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, good. And then I had that right. And can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, let's do it. So I'm Chris Swanston. I'm director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub, and I work for the Forest Service. So we'll talk about integrating climate change into natural resources management decisions. Let's see. All right. First, just a bit about the Institute. NIACS, as it's called, is actually chartered by the Forest Service and universities, nonprofit, and tribal conservation organizations within the Forest Service. And this is to Anita's point earlier. We are chartered by both the Northern Research Station and the Eastern Region, which runs our national forests up here. Our focus is carbon and climate. And what we do is provide practical information and adaptation resources to anybody who wants them, as well as technical assistance in applying that information. We focus on climate adaptation and carbon management. We have about 20 staff members. Just about half of them are focused on outreach and support. All right, so adaptation is the adjustment of systems in response to climate change. That's about the simplest definition you'll find, and it encapsulates many much longer and more complex definitions. Critically, adaptation actions that you might enact are designed to intentionally address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. We add on in order to meet goals and objectives because in management agencies, that's critical. I want to emphasize that we're not throwing out generations of knowledge and learning about sustainable management, conservation, and restoration. When we're talking about climate adaptation, we're building on those things. The other thing, and I'm going to come back to this again and again, is that when you're talking about climate adaptation, you are always talking about values and risk. Whether you make that explicit or not, those things underlie every discussion about climate change and about adaptation. It's best to at least be thinking about that because it helps with communication and discussion. So when we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about vulnerability and change. You can think about a system the way it is now, and if you're managing that system, you may have some vision of that system going into the future. We can call that a desired future condition. Now, climate change is going to apply pressure to that system, perhaps moving it into a different trajectory than previously, and perhaps different than what you envisioned for the future. So then back to that basic question, what can you do to help the system cope with that climate pressure? And how can you do that in a way that helps you meet your goals and your objectives for that system? People talk about a few really general adaptation options, resistance and resilience are broad adaptation options that are much more about persistence, maintaining the existing system. Transition is really about promoting change. One thing that I'll emphasize here is that regardless of which of these options you pursue, the critical thing is to choose actions that are robust as much as possible across a range of plausible future climates. And I'll come back to this occasionally. We don't get a single climate with some variability in the future. We have to plan for a range of future climates. So just to jump into these a bit, so resistance, that's really about improving the defenses of a system. You can think about this as a useful set of actions where that system has high value, is brittle, is a system where for whatever reason, it could be economic, it could be aesthetic, it could be cultural, you don't want that system to change, or you don't feel that it can withstand any strong pressures at all to change without collapsing. And so you may pursue options. They could be fire breaks where you've never put them. They could be increased investment into removing invasives, changes in infrastructure, whether removal, perhaps even excluding people altogether from places where they had been able to go before. The changes that you'd never thought of before, but now you're thinking of them given climate change. Some people will say that resistance is not adaptation. I strenuously disagree with that. You are the one adapting in this case because the system itself may not be able to adapt or you don't want it to. So you adapt your management to help maintain the system as it is. One thing to consider with resistance is imagine that you have the climate pushing that system into a different trajectory. You're trying to keep it the same. The further the climate wanders from where it is now or has been in the past, the more resources you will need to invest into maintaining that system the way it is, and the higher risk you begin to accumulate in that system of your objectives failing or the system itself failing. So again, resistance is about persistence, and with greater change in climate, it generally becomes much higher risk. So resilience, this is this word we are all painfully familiar with. It's everybody's favorite word to use basically however they like. Not that I have an attitude about it, but frankly, I guess I do. Uh, for many systems, this is our best near-term choice. I will say, okay, back to my attitude, I'll stop myself from fully diatribing, but just a small diatribe. Be very careful how you use this word. We use it in the original definition of hauling back from 1973 in terms of the system's ability to absorb a disturbance and return back to its original character. Now, you can imagine stretching a rubber band and having that rubber band come back to the way it was. That's that basic idea of resilience. A lot of people have started using resilience to refer to resilience of a future system. We always refer to resilience of the existing system. That is an absolutely critical difference because it can be that in pursuing resilience activities, you are essentially replacing the existing system with a different system that itself will be resilient sometime in the future. That can create massive and troublesome miscommunications with people who value the existing system the way that it basically is now and want you to invest in maintaining the persistence of that system. Now, certainly the idea of resistance, again, like a rubber band, it can stretch a bit, come back to the way it was, but it is still a persistence set of actions. And so over time, to the extent that climate wanders from where it is, you can imagine that, again, you will incur greater risk the further the climate wanders and need to apply greater investment and more intensive activities to maintain the system. And then you have transition. Now, transition is this idea where you are intentionally promoting change, fostering change. Uh, it again, coming back to this idea of values, it could be that you don't value the system greatly the way it is now and have some idea of a future condition that you value more, or you recognize that the existing system is in fact quite vulnerable, will not persist no matter how much you invest, or will take much more than you can invest in order to persist. And so given your values, you are willing to promote change in that system. To ground this a little bit in something many of us are familiar with, think about restoration. Now, here's a little flip for you. In terms of restoration, many systems that we don't value and don't want are in fact resilient. We would like to restore those systems back to some perhaps past condition that itself will be resilient to a range of future climates. In other words, we want to transition the existing system to a different system. That is transition, and it's also in that sweet spot of restoration. Now, when we are transitioning, and people who restore systems know about this, we incur risk almost immediately, especially if we're thinking about climate change. You may be wanting to establish species that are resilient to a range of future plausible climates, but aren't entirely resilient to our current climate. And so you may see failure in the near term of establishing that system. But ideally, in the long term, you are reducing your risk by ensuring that the system which you are changing, the new system which you are creating, is going to be more resilient across more of that range of future plausible climates. So again and again, I've come back to this idea of managing risk. That's really what you're doing in adaptation, and inherent in the concept of risk is what you value. And so that may mean that you are trying to help the systems that exist now persist just like they are, or pretty much like they are, and persist further into the future. That may mean that you're willing to give up on this system as it is now and help it change into something that itself in the future may be more resilient. So how does that really work when it comes to planning? I can give you a single answer that itself is a pretty robust answer, which is obviously completely cheating, and I apologize for that. But it really does depend, and it depends on several things. It depends on the ecosystem itself, your objectives for that ecosystem, the climate pressures and how they may change over time, your risk tolerance or the risk tolerance of your stakeholders or your bosses, the capacity of your organization to invest in the near and long term, and many other things. And depending on which one of these occurs to you first, you may jump to yet another one and then another one. And before you know it, you're in this crazy spin of jumping back and forth, and then bam, there you are in some kind of decision paralysis. And this is what happens to many organizations that are trying to do the right thing, but this is such a complex set of considerations. So what we did is we created a set of adaptation resources to help address this issue. We designed it to accommodate all kinds of different goals in landowners and approaches. We do not make recommendations in this process. The user is the one who is making all the decisions and driving their own vehicle through this. Now, these resources include critically an adaptation workbook and menus of adaptation strategies. And of course, the original versions were paper copies with Excel. Now we have an app that we think is quite useful. So the Adaptation Workbook, you'll recognize this as an adaptive management process. The one that April showed earlier is the Climate Smart adaptation process that was in part developed from this one, and the Adaptation for Conservation Targets, ACT, process that Molly Cross developed. So obviously we think this one is the best because it's ours. But really all of these are just adaptive management processes. Find one that works for you and use it. This one, its biggest criticism is that it was designed for professionals, and it's a heavy lift for people who are not, or who are not working in teams with more resources, and that is a very fair criticism. All right, so how does it work? Define your objectives for a place, and then consider the broad trends regionally that cover that place, but consider the place itself and what may be vulnerable in that place. Use what you know about that place. It could be data, it could be your personal experience with that place, and people tend to know much more than some book that was developed by some computer, how a place is going to react to different kinds of inputs and pressures. It could be also that you have generations of knowledge that really can cover that place and give you much deeper insights. Consider then, after you've thought about the place and how it may respond to changes in climate, how that may actually affect your management objectives. Are they actually still viable? If so, how can you tweak them to ensure that you're successful in reaching them. Those tweaks, that's basically what adaptation is. And then how can you communicate to others what your adaptation intent is so they understand in the next generation or the generation after what you were trying to do with some given action on the ground that may look like just any other action. And then finally, how do you monitor specifically if you were effective in those actions? Again, many of you will recognize this as adaptive management tailored to climate change. So that's the process. This is actually also a workbook. And so each one of these columns, this is step 1 and step 4, has a specific set of questions that walk the user through the process. And in responding to these questions one at a time and binning information, basically what we're trying to do is just break all of this into bite-sized pieces, stop people from vapor locking and going into paralysis. And that's essentially the secret of how it works. It also works with these adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. So just like a menu in a restaurant, these are possible things that you can choose. They're actions that you can take, but you wouldn't choose all of them. And some of them just really don't work together. So you really choose the ones that are most relevant to you and your set of conditions. What they help you do is, again, and I mentioned this earlier, connect what you're doing on the ground to your broad adaptation pathway that will get you to your goal on the landscape. And in doing that, it ensures that you are being intentional about your adaptation, not just, for example, saying, hey, well, if I'm, choosing biodiversity, that will get me there, right? You are describing how it will get you there. And likewise, if somebody challenges you or just asks you, or you want to explain what you're doing, it helps you in communicating what that adaptation pathway looks like. And if you're just starting in all this stuff, it really helps brainstorm seeing all of these strategies and approaches in one place, and in some cases helps you to be to perhaps for the first time to express what had been just a general understanding in your organization, and now you're putting it in writing. So we have lots of these menus at this point. Originally, it was just forestry, and as this system began to be used by more and more organizations with different goals and different mandates, they began to request and then ultimately to design for themselves with our support menus that were specific to their disciplines or their activities. They do this because, again, these menus help you to be explicit about your adaptation intention. And so it helps if the menu is designed with strategies that make sense to you. They may be about protecting watersheds, not just about forestry. They may be about habitat and not watersheds. They phrase things in ways that make sense to you, your stakeholders, and your bosses. We've also, in creating these menus, really created a tiered hierarchy. Out there in the literature, everything is called a strategy. It doesn't matter if it takes an act of Congress or it's just you putting a backyard barrel to collect some rainwater and feed your garden. These are all called strategies. We tier these instead into things that make sense, that range from on-the-ground activities up to broad approaches at the landscape level. We do this by thorough research in the academic and gray literature, but we also conduct extensive interviews with both academics and especially with practitioners. And then once we collate all this stuff and organize it, then we run that by those people again, and ultimately we test it on actual projects using the workbook. And then we iterate until we get it right, and then we publish it. So the tiering is basically these options that I described: resistance, resilience, transition. Strategies are somewhat more specific, but still pretty broad, covering a variety of resources and sites. Approaches, still pretty broad, but more specific, perhaps more specific to a resource issue or a geography. And finally, the tactic is what you would use to describe what you're actually doing on the ground. When you join the workbook and the menu, what you're really doing is you're connecting the dots. And you can imagine, and I'll say that we designed this whole process with resource managers on a national forest. you can imagine that somebody may point to what you're doing on the ground and say, this looks just like what you always do. Have you actually considered climate change? To our management and objectives. So these adaptation pathways ultimately get us to our adaptation, to our management goals. So using those things together, you can, they can help you not only more intentionally design adaptation, but also more clearly communicate what it is you're doing. Now, we have done this on more than 350 projects on all different kinds of ownerships, and I'll admit primarily in our, our backyard. This is where we're supposed to be working, in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. This is where Region 9 of the Forest Service is, and Northern Research Station. It's where we were designed to work. Now, over time, as this has become more popular, we've gotten more and more pressure to work nationally, and really just in the last couple of years, we've begun to do that. So I'll go over just a couple of examples for you of what this might look like, really short ones. I only have a couple that are in your backyard. I didn't do these myself, so I'll only have just a real general knowledge of them. But one is the Balcones Canyonlands in Vireo Preserve. This is just outside of Austin, I understand. And so this is, I think, a maybe 215 or 250 acre portion of this preserve, which itself is much larger. And their goal is to protect warbler habitat and essentially pursue resistance activities for refugia. They also want to promote water retention, and do that in part by protecting good soils they have and restoring degraded soils. And then also they want to develop alleys for pollinators, and do that through increasing their connectivity. Now, you'll recognize what they identified as climate challenges. It's hotter, it's drier, the extremes are worse, but then they're also getting these extreme rain events, and those increase their erosion. They're beginning to see habitat shifts. They expect those to continue and get worse. Those are throwing off phenology, which are affecting their pollinators. They are also creating this unfortunate feedback loop for recruitment, especially of their juniper. And so they're losing seed bank, and they see that as continuing. Now, they used the forestry menu to design, so you can use multiple menus, but they use the forestry menu to design some of their activities and share them. Those include planting drought-tolerant species in more xeric sites to provide shade and help, generally with microclimate, increasing native plant and structural diversity. Again, that's really about microclimate and creating positive feedback loops into the system's resilience. And then also in terms of management, recycling dead biomass on site to increase soil health and help with restoration. We have also the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma. They have a small wetland area. It's important to them for wildlife habitat, but also just as a resource and a connection with nature for tribal members. It's actually pretty close to one of their tribal offices, and provides a really nice demonstration site for whatever they want to do. Their challenges are pretty much the same ones that I just described for Austin. Now, these folks used the tribal adaptation menu. They were part of a tribal adaptation workshop that was held in Wisconsin, and they shared this with us. Allowed us to put this up on our website. You can see all of these on forestadaptation.org /demos, or just go to forestadaptation.org and find them. So the tribal adaptation menu is different from the other menus, really, of course, in a variety of ways, as you would expect. But I guess I would say foremost amongst, I can't even say foremost, I'll say first literally, in that the first 3 strategies in the tribal adaptation menu, which are not in any of the other menus. The first strategy begins with consider cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. And the first approach of that first strategy is to consult cultural leaders, key community members, and elders. And so, although there may be specific actions that are perhaps classic Western restoration that they could take in this wetland environment, really the key strategy that they're pursuing here and first and sharing with us is that they want to go and request elder input and guidance, both in what they can do with their plan and their actions, but also how they will include other community members and then talk about this in appropriate language. The next 2 strategies on that menu are to learn through careful and respectful observation and to support tribal engagement in the environment. So really, they're hitting these first 3 and really core strategies in that menu. Okay, in terms of the San Bernardino National Forest, this is not in your backyard, this is over in California, but it is in Eastern California, which has some similar environments to what you all have. Um, this is a high visitor use area. The goals for this area are to accommodate that high visitor use, but to do so safely, especially as climate changes, and to, as much as possible, as a core goal, protect the site itself from damage. The challenges are similar to what you guys experience in terms of more hot days, but in terms of visitor usage, they find that with more hot days, they get more visitors and expect that to continue as they get hotter and hotter days. Also, you know, with drought and potential stream flow changes, you know, they're challenged by where they allow access and how they allow access. And then, given the way that this site works, they're quite worried about extreme precipitation, not just because of erosion, but because of visitor safety. Additionally, wildfire, which we're normally used to hearing about in terms of ecology, is a safety issue here. In part because when people are here, they're generally outside of cell phone range, and in part because, again, of the way that this site is situated. They used the recreation menu. Some of the things that they came up with were to build toilets and other infrastructure in lighter colors, or paint them lighter colors to reduce heat exposure. Likewise, in building shade structures that will not only help people in terms of reducing heat exposure, but they can build them in places that will draw people away from sensitive areas. Likewise, in terms of visitor safety, they also talked about increasing staff into shoulder seasons, which themselves are expanding as seasons shift and the climate changes. And then finally, as I mentioned, this area being out of cell phone range, they're working with a telecommunications company to try to ensure that they can reach people, or people can call out with emergencies in situations that are dire. All right, 3 crazy fast examples. Again, there are hundreds of these. Go to forestadaptation.org demos. You can browse through a bunch of them that are online and see how people respond to their ecosystems and what they perceive as different threats to their ecosystems and their objectives. Oh, as a plug, so this has been a great Climate 101 course you've all engaged in. A kind of another step to that is active planning. If you have actual projects you would like to use to incorporate climate adaptation into them, we are providing an online 8-week course with weekly lectures and bi-weekly discussion sessions and coaching on demand. 3 of these are planned for fall, winter, and spring. You can see the link down there, or contact me. So a few concluding thoughts. first, certainty is a myth. It really always has been, but I would just say it's worse than ever. We have an expectation of the climate being a certain way. We don't get that anymore. Our generation was really the last to have that as any kind of reasonable expectation. It was actually false during our generation. We just didn't know it. Instead, plan for a range of future climates. And in planning for that range, which is a different mindset than planning for a climate, you can begin to make more robust choices. There are lots of tools that will help you to do this. Use any tool that makes sense to you. But the key point here is that your judgment is the best tool. None of these tools replace your judgment, your understanding of the places you work and the people who work with those places. Ours is a tool, a planning tool. We think it's great because we design it, we've seen it work. There are lots of planning tools. Use any planning tool that works for you. It might not be ours, it might be the Climate Smart one, it might be ACT or some other one. Use what works, but plan. We talk about climate-informed choices. They're not always gonna be ideal. In fact, a lot of the time they may be really painful and difficult. We call them climate informed because sometimes calling them climate and smart just seems insulting. You may be forced into a choice because of a mandate, a law like Endangered Species Act, and people who use terms like climate smart, sometimes they don't report to, say, a tribal council or aren't mandated to do something by a law or aren't stopped from doing something by stakeholders. When we work with public lands, a lot of the time we have to do the very best we can, but our options are very limited. They aren't always what some might consider the climate smart options. So we need to make climate informed choices and be very clear about what those choices are and what the risks associated with those choices are. If we're essentially mandated to act in a certain way, make the best of it, but also be clear about the risks and the potential for failure and what the trade-offs are. Likewise, if we are able to change and we're making what we think are really good choices, and those choices involve shifting the system from one state to another, one character to another, don't just call that resilience. Be clear that you are changing the system. Let people object, let people be upset. That is better than those same people finding out after the fact that you've done that and then no longer trusting you and slowing everything else down. Finally, let's make those choices as best we can now by acting, and then let's share with each other what we've done, what we've learned, where we failed, where we've succeeded. Because right now, it's critical to learn quickly and to share that learning with each other. So that's it. Thanks very much. Hopefully I haven't gone over by too much.